This BYU Forum address by Roger Porter was given on February 15, 2005.
Professor Roger Porter is a BYU alumnus, having received his BA degree here. He was subsequently selected as a Rhodes Scholar and as a Woodrow Wilson Fellow, receiving his Bachelor of Philosophy degree from Oxford University. He received his MA and PhD degrees from Harvard and joined the faculty there in 1977. His teaching and research focus on the relationship between business and government, strategic management, domestic and international economic policy, and the American presidency. There is much, much more that I could tell you about Dr. Porter, but we want to give him as much time as possible for his address. You should know, however, that Dr. Porter and his wife, Ann, are the parents of 4 children. Let's give Dr. Porter a warm welcome to Brigham Young University.
Well, I appreciate very much that generous introduction. In some ways, it seems like yesterday when I stood here to deliver a forum address nearly 3 decades ago. In other ways, much has changed, and it is about some of those changes that I want to speak this morning. My subject today is presidential power. The 11 years I have spent working in the real West Wing have influenced my thinking. As we come to know through experience, organizations and institutions look somewhat different from the inside, and the White House is no exception. One experience will illustrate the point. It was a Tuesday morning. I was attending a meeting of what was called the Cabinet Council on Economic Affairs. This is the group of individuals who advise the President on economic policy. We were meeting in the Roosevelt Room, which is one of the 2 meeting rooms in the West Wing of the White House. The President was not in attendance at this particular session, so the meeting was being chaired by the Secretary of the Treasury. Midway through the meeting, David Gergen, who was serving as President Reagan's assistant for communications, came in and asked me if I'd step out in the hall. When I got there, he turned to me and he said, "Are you an expert in industrial policy?" And I said, "Yeah, as a matter of fact, I know quite a bit about it. Why?" And he said, "Can you come brief the President?" And I said, "Certainly. When?" And he said, "Right now." I said, "Dave, I'm in the middle of a meeting of the Cabinet Council on Economic Affairs. My principal responsibility in the White House at that time was managing the activities of this council. It was very unusual for me to be out of the room." I said, "Can't we at least wait until the meeting's over?" He said, "No, we need to go right now. The President has an interview with Forbes magazine in 20 minutes. Now, the standard operating procedure in the White House is that each night the President receives a briefing book. And in that briefing book is a briefing memo for every meeting that he's going to attend the following day. If the meeting is with some media organization, the briefing materials will include, among other things, a set of anticipated questions and suggested responses. He will review those the night before, and then about 20 minutes before he's going to go into the interview, normally a small group of people who are considered experts in the subject matter that's expected to come up will assemble, meet with him, answer any questions he has, make sure he's ready for the interview. Well, I immediately turned to Gergen and said, "Can I see the materials that went to him last night on industrial policy?" Because I wanted to have a chance to look over them before it came my turn in the meeting. He shuffled through his papers, found them, handed them to me. I started glancing over them. He grabs me up by the arm and said, come on, let's go." And we rolled down the hall and into the Oval Office. Well, you can imagine my surprise when we got in there, and I looked around, and there was no one there yet, except the President. Now, I don't know what your view is of Ronald Reagan. I did not know him well before I went to work for him in January of 1981. The impression I had of him was one that I had largely gained from what I had read, seen, and heard in the media. I had the opportunity to work for him the whole of his first term, most of the first year of the second term. As his White House economic advisor, I ended up seeing a lot of him. I found him to be, in person and in private, very different than I had expected. I found him to be one of the most confident, secure people I have ever met. On this particular occasion, however, he seemed a little anxious. And he turned to Dave Gergen and said, in a very calm, controlled voice, "How did this get on my schedule?" And Gergen said to him, "Mr. President, I made the request over 3 months ago, went through the normal scheduling process. Look, this is not a hostile publication. We don't expect they're going to try to trap you, ask you any trick questions. They just want to know your views." The President said, "Could you ask them to ask me about Central America?" I was sitting there saying to myself, what is going on? Well, I discovered subsequently he had just come from an hour-and-a-half meeting on Central America. He was all ready to answer any questions about that. Now he was being asked to shift gears, think about something totally different. Dave said to him, "Well, Mr. President, I can ask them to ask you about Central America, but as you know, this is a business publication. They want to know your views on the economy. They've told us they're particularly interested in your views on industrial policy." The President said, "I know, I read that stuff on industrial policy last night. I read it twice." And then he said something I suspect I will never forget. He said, "I feel like I'm cramming for a final exam." And I suspect that's what that job feels like an awfully lot of the time. Dave says to him, "That's all right. Don't worry. Roger's here. He'll explain it all to you." The President turns and looks at me. Now, I don't know if you, what you would do in a situation like that. I remember on this particular occasion, my hands went up almost as in self-defense, and I said, "Mr. President, I've glanced over the materials that went to you last night on industrial policy. I saw you had some sheets sitting on his lap, and I assumed that's what they were. If I were you, I wouldn't invest any more time with them." And I saw this look of relief cascade down his face, quickly followed by that look which said, "Okay, so what do I say when they ask me about industrial policy?" And I said, "Mr. President, there are only 3 things that you need to know about industrial policy. If you can remember those 3 things, then you can use one or some combination of them to answer any question they can ask you." I was then frantically trying to think of 3 things about industrial policy. This fits into my firmly held conviction that for most of us, most of the time, it's hard to remember more than 3 things. And what you're trying to do in a situation like that is not make someone the world's leading expert in industrial policy, but to get them confident going into an interview. By the way, these people who get to the top in our political system are terrific in situations like that. He clicked in, we spent the next 15 minutes talking about industrial policy, and from my standpoint, the interview went well. Well, I want to use that rule of 3 this morning and to talk with you about 3 things. First, I want to briefly examine the nature of power in the American political system and the claim articulated by Richard Neustadt in 1960 that presidential power is the power to persuade. Secondly, I want to examine several major developments that have occurred in our political system since 1960. And third, I want to assess how these developments have shaped the president's power and how he exercises it. When the framers of the Constitution gathered in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, 2 ideas dominated their discussions. First, virtually all the delegates recognized and accepted the need for a stronger central government. The loose arrangements adopted in the wake of the successful revolution had proven inadequate. At the same time, the delegates were acutely aware of the potential for abuse associated with concentrated power. Under the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, I love the optimism in that phrase, there was no chief executive, no president of the United States. The arrangement reflected the skepticism toward executive power found in the 13 states. Governors were effectively subservient to legislatures. In 8 of the states, the governor was elected by the legislature. In 10 of the states, the governor was elected for a one-year term. At the Constitutional Convention, some delegates seriously advanced the idea of a plural executive, a three-member body with one member coming from the northern states, one from the southern states, one from the middle states. The commanding presence of George Washington, presiding at the convention, served to allay the fears of many delegates. Over the summer, they finally settled on a single executive who could succeed himself and who was elected in the first instance independently from the legislature. The president, however, was given few formal powers. The office of the presidency that emerged was a unique entity, born in the soil of skepticism regarding the ability to exercise power wisely and of the potential for abuse associated with concentrated power. Well, what has happened to this office in the intervening years? In what ways do presidents exercise power? Perhaps the most clearly articulated exposition of presidential power is that advanced by Richard Neustadt in his book by that title. First published in 1960, Neustadt's argument rests on three central claims. First, the president is the focus of enormous expectations and is constantly pressed to respond to a wide variety of pressures and appeals. In this sense, he is like a clerk. Whether the president can become a leader is for Neustadt an open question, but that he is a clerk is beyond dispute. Secondly, the president seeks to respond to these pressures in a system of separate institutions sharing power. The president's capacity to act on his own, to command, is limited. He requires the agreement and the acquiescence of others, and therefore the essence of presidential power is the power to persuade. His third claim is that in seeking to persuade others, the president has two assets, in addition to his limited formal powers. His professional reputation, how he's viewed by those with whom he must deal inside the Beltway, those in the Congress, in organized interest groups, in the media, and his public prestige, how he's viewed by those outside the Beltway, in the country at large. As his public prestige rises, it positively influences his professional reputation. As his professional reputation is strengthened, his ability to persuade is enhanced. Well, the publication of Presidential Power was greeted with much acclaim and has dominated scholarship on the presidency ever since. My task this morning is to assess whether this formulation of presidential power remains valid today, what has changed since 1960, and have these changes reinforced or altered the argument that presidential power is the power to persuade. Well, one set of institutional developments involves the Congress. In 1960, power in Congress resided in a small number of hands. Lyndon Johnson was, in Robert Caro's memorable phrase, the master of the Senate. Sam Rayburn, the Speaker, played a similar role in the House of Representatives. An entrenched seniority system accentuated the role of committee chairman. Dwight Eisenhower could negotiate with Lyndon Johnson and Sam Rayburn, confident that once agreement was reached, they could deliver the votes. Today, power is much more widely distributed within the Congress. The mid-1970s brought to Washington a large number of new members determined to change the institution. They successfully challenged the seniority system, replacing 3 committee chairmen. The surviving chairman began to share more responsibility with subcommittees. More recently, term limits for the leadership and committee chairs have extended this movement toward a wider sharing of power. Greater democratization is also reflected in the growth of congressional caucus organizations with whom congressional leaders must deal. The first modern caucus organization was formed in 1955. Today, there are nearly 300 caucus organizations in the House, the Senate, or both chambers. Congress has also greatly enhanced its own capabilities and reduced its dependence on the executive branch. Personnel and committee staff have grown nearly threefold since 1960. The Congressional Budget Office, created in 1974, is a highly professional, bipartisan resource that Congress now relies on for estimates of the costs of programs and proposals. The Congressional Research Service has grown fourfold since 1960. As power has diffused and Congress has become more independent, the individual ties between members of Congress and their constituents have strengthened as party organizations have receded. Congressional candidates largely raise their own campaign funds and build their own organizations. The amount of time that members of Congress spend in their home districts and states has risen steadily. Before 1970, House and Senate members averaged 2 to 3 days a month at home. By 1980, House members were spending an average of about 10 days a month at home. The House and Senate now rarely hold votes on Mondays or Fridays, permitting members to utilize a Tuesday to Thursday schedule in Washington when Congress is in session. The transportation and communications revolutions, computers and the internet have changed the work style of members of Congress, their staffs, and the House and Senate as institutions. Since 1960, the percentage of House members' staffs located in a member's home district has more than doubled. Today, it approaches 50%. One consequence of these trends is that members of Congress spend less time with their colleagues on either side of the aisle, outside of formal sessions and meetings. Another major development is the increased use of procedural devices designed to delay and block action. The time taken to complete the confirmation process for presidential nominees has lengthened as senators increasingly seek to extract concessions as the price of permitting nominees a confirmation vote. The number of times senators use the filibuster or threaten its use has increased dramatically over the past 40 years. It's now considered routine that one must secure 60 votes in the Senate in order to pass major legislation. A relatively new device, increasingly used by a determined minority party, is to stall, delay, and even fail to appoint conference committee conferees. The frustration associated with these tactics has led to a series of adaptations. The number of bills enacted by Congress has declined, while the length of bills has increased. Now, omnibus pieces of legislation and the device of budget reconciliation are increasingly used. The combination of these developments has significantly transformed the Congress, producing a legislative body where power is widely distributed, where enhanced internal capacity makes it less dependent on the executive for information and estimates, where members feel a close, direct tie to their constituents, and where procedural devices have made producing outcomes more difficult and challenging. The executive branch of the government over this period has also undergone significant change. The number of presidentially appointed officials has risen sharply. This reflects the creation of new departments and an increase in the number of political appointees in traditional departments. By January 20th of 2001, not only had the Senate-confirmed bureaucracy grown to roughly 500 cabinet and sub-cabinet posts, but President Bush also had the opportunity to appoint 2,000 or so non-Senate confirmed political appointees. In short, presidents have far greater latitude in filling their administrations with appointees whom they select and whom they can replace. At the same time, the president's immediate resources have grown. The Office of Management and Budget has quadrupled in size. New entities dealing with trade, economic and domestic policy, the environment, drug control, science and technology, and homeland security have now joined the executive office of the president. In short, the president has substantially more capacity to oversee and direct the activities of his branch of the government. The milieu in which presidents operate, however, has become more congested, complicated, and robust, with the growth of organized interests and think tanks. It was not until 1974 that Washington, D.C. overtook New York as the city with the largest number of national associations headquartered there. Today, Washington outstrips New York and every other city by an order of magnitude. Precise and comparable estimates of the number of voluntary organizations are difficult to come by. The most careful studies suggest that the number of such organizations has grown between 4- and 5-fold since 1960. But it's not merely the growth of the number of organized interests eager to be heard that has reshaped the policy landscape, but also the creation of a host of so-called think tanks, research institutions, filled with highly educated and creative individuals advancing ideas, producing analysis, and generating estimates. The quality of their work earns them a voice as proposals are debated and policies are negotiated. A fourth development concerns the media. Recent decades have seen a transformation of the media. In 1960, 3 television networks each had 15-minute evening national news broadcasts. Those days have given way to a time of intense competition between and within media organizations. Print, electronic, and digital news organizations now vie with one another for readers and viewers. The 24-hour news cycle is filled with scores of active, aggressive news organizations. The transportation and communications revolutions have enabled the president to travel faster, farther, and more frequently. How things have changed since George Washington, as president, traveled for 2 months throughout the South with no known itinerary, or since Woodrow Wilson spent 6 months in Europe following the end of World War I. Today, technology permits the president to communicate through a wide variety of channels and in a large number of ways. And the media, for its part, driven by the desire to be first, is constantly pressing for new news and new initiatives. 2 major substantive developments have also served to reshape the office of the president and presidential power. The federal budget today is far less flexible than in 1960, when over 70% of expenditures were discretionary. The rise of entitlement programs and their expansion, along with net interest payments, now dominate federal outlays, accounting for nearly 70% of expenditures. The statutory language, "such sums shall be spent," means that entitlement program outlays do not go through the appropriations process. Eager to do good and frustrated by restraints on discretionary spending, much activity has now shifted toward expanding federal credit policies and using tax expenditures to achieve policy goals. Federal regulatory activities have also undergone a sea change. Since 1970, we have witnessed a sharp reduction in economic regulation as we have deregulated airlines, trucking, oil, natural gas, financial services, and telecommunications, among others, and a simultaneous increase in social value regulation relating to the workplace, health, safety, and the environment. The costs of complying with regulatory mandates are difficult to determine precisely, but the most careful estimates place them between $600 and $800 billion a year. Pursuing goals through developing and enforcing regulations has become a growth industry in recent years. Well, what are the consequences of these developments for the exercise of presidential power? How have they altered the ways in which presidents provide leadership and pursue their policy goals? Significantly, the president's formal powers have changed little since 1960. What has changed, in part in response to these developments, is what I like to call the 3 presidencies: the legislative presidency, the administrative presidency, and the rhetorical presidency. Time will permit only a brief discussion of each. The idea that presidents must persuade others in order to accomplish their goals remains true for a large swath of public policy. From Social Security to tort reform, from taxes to tariffs, presidents must persuade and bargain and negotiate. What might be called the legislative presidency remains alive and well. The president achieving his objectives through legislation is still important, but it's more challenging and difficult. With whom does he negotiate? Can they deliver? In 1990, George H.W. Bush determined to engage the Congress in a summit on the budget. After months of discussion and consultations failed to produce agreement, a novel device was adopted. Democrats and Republicans in the House and Senate agreed to each send 5 leaders and committee chairs to represent their body to join 5 officials representing the administration. The 25 of us met for 11 days and nights at Andrews Air Force Base, negotiating a budget deficit reduction agreement. The explicit understanding was that a majority of Republicans and a majority of Democrats would support the negotiated agreement. Ultimately, 24 of the 25 participants approved the outcome. The agreement was then brought to a vote on the floor of the House and the Senate. The Speaker of the House, the majority and minority leaders of both House and Senate went into the wells of their respective bodies and spoke in favor of the legislation. The President declared his willingness to sign the legislation, but the measure failed to achieve the support of a majority of Republicans and Democrats. In conversations with members of both parties, I was told that a principal reason the legislation was defeated was that this represented a way for individual members to send a signal to their leaders that they could not be told how to vote and that they must be consulted more fully. A more inclusive round of negotiations was required before a revised bill was passed. The clash of ideas and priorities, coupled with the advent of what is often referred to as the permanent campaign, has often contributed to legislative gridlock. 4 years ago, George W. Bush identified a comprehensive energy bill and faith-based initiatives as among his highest legislative priorities. Even with Republican majorities in both houses, the legislation has languished. Today, fewer bills are passed. More policy is shaped through large omnibus pieces of legislation. In particular, the annual Budget Reconciliation Act, now a staple of the legislative agenda, is where policy of all types is enacted. Even a determined president finds the legislative terrain difficult to traverse. While the legislative presidency remains central, indeed essential, for much public policy, presidents frustrated by the challenge of achieving their objectives through legislative means have increasingly sought to pursue their policy goals through administrative means. As we have now seen, they have much more capacity to do so. It's not merely the difficulties of the legislative process, but also the decline of the share of the budget that is discretionary and the rise of regulation as a means for achieving public purposes that has accentuated what might be called, or what I like to call, the administrative presidency. Today, more and more policy is made through the regulatory process. In the past quarter of a century, Congress has enacted only one major piece of environmental legislation, the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. Who would claim, however, that we've not had a great deal of federal environmental policy over this period? Environmental policy continues to be discussed and debated, considered and contested. Much of the focus of this debate, however, is in the regulatory process. And those dissatisfied with the outcome utilize the courts as one of the avenues for redress. Indeed, the judiciary has become a second arena where these policy battles increasingly occur. In addition to regulations, presidents also have in their administrative arsenal executive orders, executive agreements, and presidential memoranda and directives. Members of Congress view the expansion of administrative activity by both Republican and Democratic administrations as something of a challenge, and they have responded. The Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974, the Wars Powers Act of 1973 illustrate the phenomenon of legislative efforts to formally restrain presidential power. Congress, when possible, enacts more detailed legislation, reducing executive discretion. This period has witnessed the rise of more frequent and aggressive oversight hearings. Congress has also increasingly used the confirmation and appropriations processes to influence administrative actions. The evidence for this is striking. Executive branch officials of whatever political party are eager for maximum discretion in administering the programs under their direction. During the late 1990s, and increasingly in the period since 2000, individual members of Congress have secured what are known as earmarks in appropriations legislation, specifically directing grants rather than allowing these grants to be allocated through peer review or by executive discretion. From less than 100 earmarks a few years ago, the last round of appropriations bills reportedly contained more than 24,000 earmarks. Nonetheless, the President and the officials who serve with him increasingly use administrative means to achieve their goals. As John Dingell, Chairman of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, told me during the Clean Air Act negotiations when I was arguing against limiting executive discretion on a particular matter, even if we include this provision, those of you in the executive branch will still have the upper hand. I will let you write the legislation, he told me, if you will let me write the regulations. Well, in addition to the legislative and administrative presidencies, there's a third element of presidential power, what I like to call the rhetorical presidency. George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Abraham Lincoln, 5 of our greatest presidents, collectively held office for 32 years. According to one reliable estimate, during those 32 years, they delivered 121 public addresses, averaging roughly 4 addresses a year. During his 8 years as president, Bill Clinton averaged nearly 560 addresses and public remarks each year, a pace exceeded by George W. Bush in his first 16 months in office. Presidents instinctively recognize that there are many ways to produce a desired result. Sometimes the means is passage of legislation or the appropriation of funds. Sometimes the method is through issuing regulations or an executive order. But a third way involves persuading individuals and organizations to act in particular ways, inspiring citizens to tackle literacy in their communities, urging those tempted to use illegal drugs to just say no, reminding old and young alike that no life can be considered successful that does not include service to others, encouraging states and localities to embrace national education goals and adopt standards and testing. I've had the opportunity to work with 3 presidents on 11 State of the Union addresses. In each of them, the president has devoted a portion of the address to what might be considered rhetorical efforts to influence and change behavior. I reminded President George H.W. Bush that if he was going to transform education in America, perhaps the most crucial relationship would be that of parents and their children. I urged him to draw from his own experience and to state in his own words some concrete advice to parents about how to talk to and help and work with their children in pursuing educational excellence. In early January of 1998, if you had asked President Clinton what were his 5 most important goals for the coming year, I'm confident that he would have answered that one of them was his race initiatives. He was convinced that an improvement in race relations was possible and desirable. He did not propose a single new piece of legislation. He did not issue a single new regulation or executive order. He did organize a commission to convene town halls across the country, to engage citizens in a dialogue. He did speak passionately and eloquently about his convictions on the issue. In the wake of the recent tsunami disaster in Asia, President George W. Bush called on his two immediate predecessors to join him in a concerted effort to encourage private donations to assist those in need. His action was a form of what I like to call rhetorical leadership. A part of the rhetorical presidency involves more than merely words. Presidents exercise influence not simply through what they say, but by what they do. There is a moral dimension to leadership, and character does count. Let me share with you one experience that brought this forcefully to my mind. In the summer of 1991, I accompanied President Bush to Arizona, where he signed a series of agreements negotiated under the provisions of the Clean Air Act. The site was the Grand Canyon. The President determined that before leaving, we would hike down into the canyon, and the hike proceeded in 3 groups. The small lead group included the President, a Secret Service agent, his military aide, his personal aide, a White House physician, and 2 park rangers. The next group included a dozen or so administration officials, cabinet officers, members of Congress, and local dignitaries. The third group consisted of the ever-present pool of print reporters and network correspondents. The narrow trail along the canyon wall zigzagged back and forth as we descended. The weather was hot and dry. The path was extremely dusty. At the top of the canyon, before we had begun the hike, I had declined a canteen full of water. And now, 45 minutes down the trail, I was regretting that decision. Having reached its goal, the lead party, which was about 50 yards ahead, stopped, and the President turned and looked up the trail at the other 2 groups making their way down the canyon. I was at the head of the second group and had a clear view of the President. The President's personal aide handed him a cup of water. And as he handed it to the President, it reinforced in my mind how terribly thirsty I was. And the President accepted the cup and, without pausing or hesitating, immediately handed it to the female park ranger standing next to him. For him, it was a natural gesture. He was not before the cameras or trying to impress others. I did not sense he was aware anyone even observed his generosity. Though small, his act demonstrated a concern for the welfare of others that transcended his own interests or needs. He acquired a well-earned reputation for decency and character, and by his example, he inspired others to do much good. Well, in a real sense, presidential power is still the power to persuade. The President must share power with other institutions. The limits on his capacity for unilateral action are real. And yet developments in the Congress, the executive branch, organized interests in the media, as well as in federal spending and regulation, have combined to elevate 2 other elements, what I have called the administrative presidency and the rhetorical presidency. The challenge for the President institutionally is as great as at any time in our history since George Washington first sought to define the office. Formal powers are few, expectations are high, and signs of impatience abound. Richard Neustadt was right. Presidential power is the power to persuade, and yet it is more. Presidential leadership today requires widely utilizing legislative, administrative, and rhetorical means. It is this combination of skills and abilities that presidents must master to exercise power effectively in the 21st century. Thank you very much.
This BYU Forum address by Roger Porter was given on February 15, 2005.